Welcome. This is the Free Market Roadshow, probably the largest annual series of public conferences on economics. Remarkable experts are discussing the challenges and providing libertarian solutions to today's problems. Organized by the Austrian Economic Center in cooperation with select institutes, universities and think tanks, the Free Market Roadshow tours all over Europe. Today we pay a visit to Skopje.
Dear representatives of the Free Market Roadshow, dear colleagues and students, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you today on the occasion of the 9th Free Market Roadshow at the Justinianus Primus Law Faculty in Skopje. Our faculty is part of the St. Cyril and Methodius University, the oldest, highest rank and largest university in the country. Our academic community is committed to make a better world through education, research and innovation. The general topic this year, Way Out of the Gridlock, marks the quest for restoring the orderly functioning of market mechanisms. Across the globe, the pandemic-induced recession has been used to expand the role of government, sometimes at the expense of freedom and democracy. Let me highlight that the 2021 Free Market Roadshow brings together renowned economists, prominent business leaders, and most important, students. I'm sure that our professors and students will provide valuable input to this debate. With that, let me conclude by wishing you a fruitful and memorable conference today. Our faculty remains supportive to the important dialogue on the key challenges for Europe. Thank you very much for your dedicated efforts and time, and I wish you all the best.
Hello and welcome to the Free Market Roadshow in Skopje. I'm Simon Sarevsky, a research assistant at the Austrian Economic Center, and today I will be your moderator. As the title suggests, today we're going to talk about the coexistence of the markets and the government after the pandemic. In the past few months, we at the Austrian Economic Center have talked both about the monetary and the non-monetary costs of the pandemic. Only time will tell how much we have underestimated those costs. Reading history, on the other hand, is one thing, but predicting the future is totally different thing. To get a better understanding of what's about to come and what we have to do to make that future better and more predictable is one of the main reasons we are organizing this event. To help us in this endeavor, Per Bylund will give us the keynote speech. Bylund is an assistant professor at the Entrepreneurship and Records at Johnston, a professor of free enterprise in the School of Entrepreneurship at the Oklahoma State University. He is also a fellow at the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, and he is an associate fellow at the Ratio Institute in Stockholm, Sweden.
The topic for my talk today is the destructiveness of policy. I do not mean to discuss how policy puts into use resources that would be of much greater use elsewhere and much more effective in other hands. I also do not mean to discuss how policy, while claiming to do one thing, in reality does something else. It outright destroys businesses and entrepreneurship and undermines civil society, social values and culture. Both of these aspects are relevant and important, but they are not the topic of my talk. Instead, I want to discuss with you that the state thrives on power, and what grants power is fear and dependence. And the state is making people dependent on it, both as a means for control and as an outcome of many misplaced policies intended to provide relief. We have seen a lot of fear and dependence in this pandemic. Fear has been the message that has propelled types of repressive policies that were not thought possible before. Had anyone suggested only over a year ago that whole countries, democratic European countries, would close down and quarantine people in their homes, most of us would have thought him crazy. But that happened. Because fear was drummed up, many populations went along with it. Even though they later protested and resisted, it was too late. Much of the damage was already done. And of course, many feared not only the virus, but also the police, which sometimes with enormous brutality cracked down on those seeking a breath of fresh air after weeks stuck in their homes. It is possible to roll back these policies, however. Many of them will need to be rolled back for society to start functioning again. And to be clear, it is not possible for the state to keep everyone locked in their homes for long. This is an overreach, and it points to the limit of the state's power. When the people rises in opposition, which we have seen during this pandemic, the state has no power. Much more troublesome is the other side of the lockdown and the damage caused to the economic system. Not only were people locked down, but society, and therefore practically the whole economy, was forcefully paused. The problem here is that there is no pause button for the economy. It may sound easy for politicians who have no conception of how the real world works, but you cannot simply pause a business. You also cannot pause a supply chain. If you have ever run a business, you know that being an entrepreneur is not a steady state but a changing process. It is a constant struggle to get money to come in so that you can cover costs that you assumed long ago. That's what entrepreneurs and businesses do. They assume costs and imagine that they will be paid for their efforts later, and paid more than the cost they already assumed. In other words, if you pause a business, the costs remain, but you get no revenue. How are you going to pay those bills when everything is on pause? You cannot. This is perhaps easy to understand, so easy that even some politicians grasp the concept. So many countries, like the United States, have offered relief in the form of loans to businesses. Of course, such schemes come with the usual cronyism and favoritism, so the loans often do not end up in the hands as intended. It also shifts power and influence away from the market to the bureaucrats in government. Or, to put it differently, businesses survive or go under as decided by bureaucrats, not by consumers. But there is more than simply money. Imagine food processing and a beef farmer when the politicians press pause, which stops businesses dealing with slaughtering, cutting, processing, and shipping meat. But it doesn't stop the farming. The farmer's animals will not stop growing and will not stop eating because the economy is paused. The farmer will go bankrupt because he needs to cover their food, water, and care without being able to sell any beef. Even if he has savings to cover the expense, the meat will lose quality and value as the cows grow older than their prime. At the same time, no meat is reaching the shelves in stores. So while the farmer is stuck with costs he cannot cover because he cannot sell the beef he produces, consumers cannot find meat in stores. Consequently, we experience a shortage of food, while at the same time farmers and other producers have surpluses that they cannot afford to keep and are unable to sell. What a ludicrous situation! The effect of this is, of course, that the farmer will not be able to rise again as the politicians press play on the economy and beef processing is resumed. He would not have been able to make those continuous investments in his business that he needs in order to meet future demand for meat. After all, he was stuck with additional costs and no revenue, so pressing play will not solve the food shortage. The same story can be told for other types of businesses as well. You cannot stop a freighter that's on its way around the world. You cannot store logs of timber waiting for the sawmill. You cannot simply pause mines and smelting plants. And if one task can be paused, it affects the other tasks in the supply chain. The longer the lockdown, the more businesses will have failed, and the supply chains lie in shambles. This is an enormous loss. While it can be rebuilt, it can only be so at enormous expense. And it still requires that there are people with the know-how and willingness to start such businesses again. Can we rely on them to rise to try again, even after they have been crushed? So the long-term effects of this madness are yet to be seen. Even if the virus disappears tomorrow, these problems will remain. They take time to be resolved, and it takes lots of work to piece things together again, if it is at all possible. The issue here is that this would be a very bad situation if it were a sudden shock to an otherwise healthy free market economy. But this is not the case. These Western nations were hardly free market havens. Rather, they were welfare states of varying magnitudes. And in the case of the United States, a welfare warfare state. In other words, these societies and economies were already burdened by large and very costly states, which were usurping on what market was allowed, What this means is, at least for our purposes here, that the market that existed was already burdened by financing the non-market. The state, of course, costs money, but the greater burden is the loads of people that it relieves from the discipline of the market. In a pure free market, you are paid in accordance with your contribution to the value you facilitate to consumers. To put it bluntly, if you produce lots of value, you get paid a lot. But if you produce nothing, then that nothing might be your wage. Of course, there would be systems and institutions in place to care for those in temporary unemployment, as well as for those of lesser fortune. But they would be the exception to the rule. Most people would not only be able to find a job, but would be paid what is now called a living wage. Prices are overall much lower when we are all producing, which means our wages can buy many more goods and services. It would be an easy burden to carry and to care for those who are in need when most people are able to care for themselves. It can be done privately and voluntarily. And this used to be the case. With cooperative unemployment insurances and collective sick pay funds where workers share the risk, that was the case. When the state monopolized these services, it also made them more general, and it offered them for free. Or I should say, free. The incentive became to exploit the system as much as possible, rather than contribute to but otherwise stay out of it, out of the respect of your peers. So people were trying to stay away from burdening the others. Now it's the other way around. This increased the burden, and therefore the cost, and so also taxation. And the state then hires more people to administer these systems. This was in the beginning, but it has been going on for many decades. The state is an enormous enterprise throughout Europe and the West. And much of what it does is to undermine the market by creating incentives to not work, to not produce, and to not contribute to our joint welfare. The result is that big parts of the populations do not actually contribute to the wealth of the nation. This does not only include the sick elderly and those exploiting the system because they can. It also includes everybody working for the government, who are in effect living off of the production that takes place in the market. The government does not produce any value. While the costs of the state are typically counted towards a country's GDP, it would make more sense to subtract them from the value that is created in the market. That would give us a good idea on the soundness of the economy. How many economies in the West do you think really create more value than they use up? With this enormous burden on the economy, the chances of entrepreneurship to be at all successful diminish. Even to start a business that puts enough food on the table to feed one's family is very difficult. It is made much more difficult because of the levies, taxes, licenses, regulations, and so on that politicians and bureaucrats force onto the entrepreneur and private businesses. In other words, many opportunities are simply not valuable enough to cover the extra burden placed on entrepreneurship by the state. So they remain or under-exploited. This reduces the number of jobs in businesses, which leaves even more people without possibility to make a living. And so they seek help, and therefore become embedded in the state system. The only way out is to find a job in one of those businesses that are unlikely to be started because the state has made it all too burdensome to run a business. For every person who no longer works and makes a living, and thereby no longer contributes to the economy, there is a loss of one in production and an increase of one in burden. For every person who loses their job and becomes dependent on the unemployment benefits and other such systems, the economy both loses production and must carry a heavier load. As a result, the economy becomes less lively and exuberant. There is less entrepreneurship, there is less production, which means there are less opportunities for people to find jobs. They become ever more dependent on the state. This dependence is a problem for many reasons, especially when people become dependent on the system in the long term. As a brief stop to get on one's feet again, the system would do only little harm. It would do basically what private systems used to do. But that is not how these systems work, especially when the state becomes an ever-increasing burden on value creation in the market. People get stuck in these systems because there is rarely a way out, and because the systems have been designed to be generous. They are not punishments after all. So politicians pride themselves with promising that you will not need to lower your standard of living much when you lose your job. It's a great way to get votes, and it makes you look generous and caring, but it's utterly destructive to pay people as much for not working as for when they contribute to our society's overall well-being. When people get stuck in these systems, it affects their self-esteem. And the longer they remain in these programs, the smaller the chances that they have a skill of value, a means to contribute, that they can do something that is of value still. So they lose hope, they lose confidence. They become fully dependent on the state, not only financially. When they start believing that they cannot make a living on their own, that they cannot care for themselves and their families, and when they conclude that there are no jobs for people like them, that's when they become lost and stop trying. After all, what is the point? People in this terrible situation are much more likely to be hostile toward those who are not giving them a chance. That is, businesses, entrepreneurs, the market. They're also more likely to use their vote to benefit themselves, for which you can hardly blame them. But it means the burden on the economy rapidly increases, which causes greater problems and more people dependent on the state, and even fewer in positions where they actually contribute. Add to this situation, which existed before the pandemic, the mass death of businesses following the disastrous policies adopted to fight the virus. The farmer in my example will not be able to rebuild his business. Even if he could afford it, why would he choose to build again what was once destroyed? No one will thank him, and it may be destroyed again. Why would he put in all that effort and shoulder that risk when there is little to no gratitude for what he does? There might not even be much profit. So resentment builds, the burden increases, it becomes harder to start and run businesses. More people become dependent on the state and thereby add to the burden of those who are not. This is a recipe for disaster because it leads us down only one path, which Hayek referred to as the road of serfdom. The state grows like a disease in a body that is not healthy enough to withstand the attack. Politically, this is a path to the all-encompassing state, totalitarianism. The state needs and is granted more power as more people become dependent on it. That's the sad truth, and that's what we're seeing. And those depending on it are all too willing to grant a little more to get the system fixed. The problem, however, is not the inability of the state. The state never has such ability. The problem is a lack of market, and this lack becomes more present the more the state grows. This is reason for pushing harder against the state, but for most the incentives are exactly the opposite, to ask for more. This is what we're dealing with, and why we must also break people's dependence on the state.
That was Professor Bylund explaining the role of entrepreneurship in the market economy, the relationship between the government and the private sector, and in a sense, the more we give power to the government, the more people lose at the end of the day. Now it's time to introduce you to our first speaker for the panel discussion. That is Biljana Tashevska-Talkashlieva. Biljana is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Economics Skopje at the University of St. Cyril and Methodius. She teaches economics of the welfare state and national accounts. The main scientific interests are fiscal policy, public finance, macroeconomics, the welfare state. Biljana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. First, I would like to say that I'm grateful for the invitation. I'm glad to be a part of today's event. I listened very carefully the speech from the keynote speaker, Mr. Pei Bylund, and it was a very intriguing speech. He pointed some important issues regarding the role of the state, especially in providing welfare to citizens and the effect it has on the economic activities and on incentives of economic agents. So we should stress that there is a fine line between the government helping the people in need and creating, as Mr. Bellund mentioned, dependence, a culture of dependence of a certain number of people. Modern states, especially in European countries, provide a comprehensive welfare systems to their citizens, providing healthcare, education, social protection, and this is very important. However, the design and the financing of the welfare state has implications on the functioning of the markets and on the human behavior, on the incentives of people and enterprises in their economic activities. For example, high social benefits reduce the incentive for unemployed people to seek for a job, and this is especially relevant for low-skilled workers. The other side of the coin is of great importance as well. The financing of the welfare state, namely greater expenditures require greater revenues. So there will be a need for perhaps higher taxes, or if the government cannot fund the growing expenditures in this way, then it needs, if there are persistent deficits, then it needs to borrow either on the domestic markets or in foreign capital markets. So regarding situation, the pandemic shook the world in every sense of the world. The health crisis, which affected many people, unfortunately, many outcomes, and in combination with the restrictive measures undertaken by the government, led to devastating effects on the economies and societies. Companies, we must say, need to be applauded as they managed to address the situation, to transfer their activities online. And this pandemic perhaps accelerated the process of digitalization in less digitalized societies. But the measures of the governments, as much as they were meant to prevent the spread of the virus, the economic flows in the individual countries and worldwide. We're aware that there are so many work closures, job losses, and all this leads to rising unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And afterwards, the governments had to undertake measures to help the citizens and the enterprises who have lost their incomes. So they reached for many different types of measures, subsidizing wages, contributions, payment cards for citizens, expanding social protection, etc. But all of this caused a drastic rise in government expenditures, and this is what I'd like to mention: that the rising expenditures in some countries already add to already high levels of expenditures, which are definitely in certain countries on the rise because of the aging of population. And all things together create a strong pressure on public finance. So all of the countries had deterioration in public finance, leading to strong deficits, and accumulation, of course, of public debt. And as we know, high public debt is not something that anybody wishes to persist. However, in this time of crisis, there is a little talk of debt, but we are aware that we had a situation of rising and accumulating public debt during the previous financial and economic crisis, and the subsequent need for fiscal adjustments. So the fiscal adjustments require measures such as cutting public expenditures or imposing additional higher taxes to households or to businesses, which in turn discourages private initiatives. Additionally, high public debt could result in the so-called crowding out effect via putting pressure on rising interest rates, which also discourages private investments. And one of the most cited effects, consequences from high public debt is the burden that they impose on the future generations. The structure and the size of any of the budget and of the different types of budget revenues, governments have to take account of the future that it would that as much as help is needed at the moment. Governments have to look further ahead for the needed actions that will need to be undertaken in the future. And this pandemic, especially the lockdown measures, etc., pronounced the power of the state to influence economic activity in total. And the measures undertaken, I will end with this, need to are to be temporary, but then there will be time needed for economies to recover, to restore the previous activity. It is not a touch and go system, as Mr. Peibailund also said. It takes time for the to reach a certain level of activity again. And the question arises whether the people who are now dependent on government assistance, how fast and will they manage to succeed on their own in the future? So perhaps some measures should be undertaken in the sense of active labor market policies and other structural reforms and incentives, measures to encourage people to activate again on the market. Thank you.
Thank you, Biljana. Our next speaker is Elena Makravska-Bisoska, Associate Professor at the Faculty of Economics, Skopje, at the Department of International Trade. Her main research is international economics and European economic integration. So take it away, Elena.
Thank you very much. Good day to everyone. The topic of my presentation today is the impact of human freedoms on economic growth. This is an academic paper that we jointly prepared with Katerina Shapkova-Kutavska, who is here today also. And today I will present also on her behalf. So first of all, I need to explain what is the term human freedom. It's a general term for personal, civil and economic freedom. And therefore, the purpose of our paper was to find whether there is interconnection between the economic growth and the human freedom. What is already proved in the literature is that the economic growth can impact the human freedom positively by reducing the economic inequality, creating effective institutions, and also increasing political stability. So nowadays, currently, due to the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen that the economic slowdown practically negatively influenced on the basic human rights in aspects such as lack of worsening of the quality of the food, housing, health, education, social protection, and so on. And also, main deterioration of the basic human rights can be seen in the increased surveillance, restriction on free expression and information, limits of the public participation, and so on. The general fear is that the authorities worldwide are using this current situation to repress the human rights for political purposes. And for that purpose, practically, we want to see how the human freedom is influencing on the economic growth. Since this inverse relationship is not very well understood, and it's not really proven in the academic literature that the human freedom can influence on the economic growth. So We have few research questions. First of all is to show the empirical evidence, causality between human freedom and the economic growth. And proven that, then we proceed with the OLS panel regression models. Practically, we made an econometric model in which we estimate the influence of the human freedom on the economic growth, and also we include other variables in the model. As I previously said, the main hypothesis is that the fundamental argument of this paper is that in societies where human rights are respected, they generate certainty and predictability for the economic actors, and also respecting the human freedoms practically creates economic growth and welfare. It increases investments and also increases productivity. For the human freedom, we took the human freedom index as a variable. We practically used the human freedom index, which is published by the Fraser Institute. And this index is calculated based on 79 distinct indicators, and these are grouped practically into broad categories such as personal and economic freedom. As a dependent variable, we took the GDP per capita, and therefore we include also in the OLS model trade, unemployment, total factor productivity, investment, life expectancy, and conflict as well. As I previously said, we first approach to find, is there some kind of causality between the GDP growth and human freedom index? And using the Granger causality test, we practically find that the effect of human freedom on GDP per capita is positive and statistically significant. And therefore, using the panel data econometric model, we practically estimate the value of that importance. As the model is saying, is practically that if human freedom increased by 1 unit,
I cannot hear you, Elena. Um, well, we have lost Elena, so until she comes back, probably connection problems, we are going to move to our next speaker. That is our next speaker, and actually this is the last speaker for today, and then we will move to the Q&A. It's Katerina Shapkova-Kotsevska, Associate Professor at the Institute of Business Law and Economic Sciences at the Faculty of Law Justinianus Primus at the University St. Cyril and Methodius in Skopje. Katerina teaches economics, political economy, contemporary economic theories, managerial finances, public sector economics, and public finance. Her field of research is in institutional economics and economics of education. In the next 5 minutes, she is going to talk to us about the COVID crisis and what we have learned. So, Katerina.
Thank you very much, Suman. Dear speakers, dear guests, thank you for being here today. The Free Market Roadshow has been a wonderful opportunity to discuss about various topics and to participate in challenging debates. I'm so happy that Skopje is again part of this initiative, and the Faculty of Law is actively involved into the organizing process of the Free Market Roadshow. I was very interested with the talks by Professor Bailan, Professor Tashevska-Kolkashlieva, and Professor Maktevska-Disovska. Unfortunately, when she was supposed to discuss about the results of the research, the connection has failed, but I hope that we will hear her later. They presented very interesting and provocative ideas about the consequences of the corona crisis, the influence of the markets, and the role of the governments. What are the possible dangers of the rising governmental power and the rising public debts, importance of human freedoms and institutional environment. What what I like to tangle here in this very brief presentation is the how we see Corona crisis. Usually, Corona crisis is seen as a something that has devastating negative effect. The pandemics have a devastating and negative effect on the markets, on the prosperity of the people, and on the prosperity of the economy in general. When I think about the Corona crisis, when I think about the post-pandemic world, I have a different approach. I see it as an opportunity. We all have learned many valuable lessons from the Corona crisis. It changed the way how we think, how we behave. What we learned is how important the markets are, how crucial their crucial interest on our lives and satisfying our needs as customers. Also, we learned why entrepreneurship matters and how important are the new initiatives that took place in the previous year and a half, and how a private initiative can help us prosper and overcome the negative consequences of the pandemic. Here, I would like to quote what the President John Kennedy has once said. He said, when written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters, one representing danger and the other represents opportunity. That is actually how I see the Corona crisis, how I see the pandemics. I see it as a danger on a short term, but on the long run, it represents a huge opportunity for development of the humanity and the economies. What is the most important lessons that, from my point of view, the humanity has learned from the pandemics? The COVID crisis has reminded us that change is constant. This is not a new conclusion. This is something that has been observed many years ago. But Corona is here to remind us that everything can change in a moment, that nothing is certain, and that we have to be prepared to act accordingly to the new situation. In this kind of a setting, being creative and flexible and prepared to adapt, prepared to act entrepreneurially are very important characteristics of the individuals living in the 21st century. COVID crisis has also reminded us that individuals are responsible to learn permanently, to educate themselves, to expand their knowledge in order to adapt to the new circumstances. And what is more important, the basis of the capitalistic society and economy, such as the desire for constant adaptation and change, the importance of the entrepreneurial spirit, the processes of creative destruction, voluntary exchange, has proved to be from crucial importance for overcoming the crisis and ensuring future prosperity of the countries worldwide.
Well, that was thank you, Katarina, and I would say that was really fantastic, because when we look at the Zoom calls that we've all been having, and let's call them the conferences, but aside from that part, a lot of firms have used Zoom calls at the same time, and it showed us how meaningless many of the meetings were, how much time has been lost. And as Per Bylund said, entrepreneurship will find a way, and as Katarina mentioned many times, new opportunities to innovate and make business more productive and way better. And unfortunately, we still don't have Elena to join us. She has connection problems, so I'm going to open up the discussion with Katarina and Biljana, and when Elena join us, we can all continue our discussion on the topics. So I would like to start first with a question from the audience, from Federico, and he asks, and basically this is most for Biljana, but also Katarina can weigh in. He asks, with the tax and spend policies of Biden, plus the known centralized tendencies of the EU, will we face a deadly pandemic of statism in the years to come?
The topic.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Could you just repeat the beginning of the question because I didn't hear it well?
Okay, sorry. Federico asks, with the tax and spend policies of Biden, plus the known centralizing tendencies of the EU, will we face a deadly pandemic of statism in the years to come?
So the rising statism. It's a difficult question. These debates are always a hot topic among academics and policy makers. I'm perhaps more familiar with the EU policies, but I know the centralism. I believe that every state every country still leads an individual social welfare policies, although they are coordinated. But I don't think that the world is directed so much to centralism, to totalitarianism. We'll see. I don't know. I think this pandemic actually put questions to a test, and the role of the state. It put the role of the state to a test. So the measures taken now during the pandemic are perhaps somewhat expected, but in the future, if governments want to support the private initiatives, perhaps more free space should be left to enterprises, to individuals. The growing role of the state perhaps should be more aimed at perhaps supporting the creation of human capital, providing infrastructure, improving the investment climate, but not so much directly taking measures that directly affect so much the behavior and the way the markets work.
Okay. Katerina, Elena, do you want to weigh in on this, or should I go to the next question from the audience?
I have only one short comment. Yes, it's obvious that very difficult years are coming with regard to the increased presence of the state in the economic life, and with the economic life. I think that private initiatives are going to be struggled by the state from one hand. But why am I optimistic is that many new businesses have arisen in the pandemic that are far away from the reach of the government. What I mean by this is the whole new digital world that was developed as a direct result from the crisis is far away from the hand of the government, because the government currently does not have the knowledge, does not have the instrument, and does not have the possibilities how to tax this business, how to regulate this business, and how to put this business into its control. So on one hand, I think that many businesses and the people will suffer from the rising taxes, but on the other hand, there is a bright light in the tunnel when it comes to the digitalization, which is very helpful in rising new initiatives and creating new ideas, creating new products, creating new services that cannot be, at least in the short run, regulated by the government or oppressed by the government.
Okay. Our next question from the audience is mostly aimed at Elena, but again, everybody can weigh in. And Kai asks, considering the importance of human freedom for economic growth, what concrete measures could governments implement to get us out of the COVID economic crisis?
Okay, hi Simon, I am very sorry that something interrupted my presentation. I think there was an internet lost. I just speak and then after I finished, I see that practically I was not online. I'm sorry for that. Regarding the question, I don't think that there is some kind of specific measures. But what we want to suggest practically in the paper is that practically there should not be imposed disproportionate restrictions, meaning that the challenge is practically to impose the appropriate balance between the protection of the human health and to minimize the economic consequences. As we have seen this practically last weeks, is that many of the countries are just lifting all of the restrictions, and they are practically reopening the businesses, resume the public transportation, and practically all of the public health restrictions are gradually lifting. So we believe that if there is no need for further imposement, that it should be just going in line with the economic development, because as the keynote speaker said, there is no pause button for the economy.
Thank you, Elena. Don't forget to post your questions on YouTube and Facebook. Now I would like to ask. Again something about the crisis and how different is the crisis from the 2007-2009 Great Recession. What is different? Not in how it came here, but in the government's response and what can we expect, let's say, in the future.
Okay, I can say a few words, and then my colleagues can complement them with their perhaps remarks. First of all, it is important how the crisis came. I know the question is not focused on that, but because the effects of the crisis are different if they come from economic factors or they are determined by non-economic factors. So unlike the global financial and economic crisis from 2010, the Great Recession, as it is called, the perhaps so-called Great Lockdown of 2020 was initiated, as we all know, by non-economic factors, by the pandemic. Why is this important? Usually crises that are both economic and financial, usually they last longer. It takes to recover. Well, usually the crises that are caused by non-economic factors, perhaps they have, as we are witnesses today, the present crisis actually manifests sharper downturn in economic activity. So one of the differences is that when the crisis of 2007 happened over the world, it was said that it is the biggest crisis since the Great Depression of 1929. But now this crisis caused an even sharper decline in economic activity due both to the health crisis and restrictive measures. So unlike the previous crisis that came from the financial sector and from the real estate bubbles, and then spread mostly to the advanced economies, this crisis is more real economy based, and the shocks came more on the supply side of the economy, and the disruption in economic activity is more drastic than the previous one. So the drop in GDP growth rates is bigger in this crisis. And regarding, I can mention regarding the fiscal positions of the countries. Both crises caused rising fiscal deficits, as is expected, since public revenues declined, and there was need for more expenditures, and persistent deficits naturally lead to accumulation of public debt. But unlike the previous crisis, when many countries had more fiscal space than in this crisis, now many of them began the new crisis with already smaller fiscal space, with already high public debt. So perhaps I believe that the fiscal sustainability issue will be very relevant. It is already very relevant, but I believe it will be a topic of many debates, and measures will have to be undertaken to prevent a further accumulation of public debt. And additionally, I believe that this crisis, perhaps even more than the previous one, sort of slowed down the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. I believe it hit more harder it affected more harder poverty, for example. So the effects are more sharp, more devastating. But usually, this type of crisis come with a faster recovery. So we are for that. Maybe my colleagues can add something else. Maybe I can think of another thing during the discussion.
See, I would like to ask one more thing regarding this, and that's inflation. Back during the Great Recession, Austrians like myself were saying that too much public debt is bad for the economy, and in the end will bring inflation. The Keynesians stood on the other side. They were right. Austrians like myself were wrong. But today, we are printing more money than ever, and we at the same time have not seen such public debts as we have seen during the crisis. So how and at the same time the debt to GDP is on extremely high rates. So is there a real chance of the Austrians being right and inflation is coming at our doorsteps in the next few months, or let's say the next year?
The similarity with the previous crisis is that interest rates are low now as they were low there. So there is the phenomenon of zero lower bound on the interest rates. Central bank interest rates are kept at a low level. So even with the expansionary monetary policy, in the short run, I don't think that that would cause a rising inflation. But as we all know, the public debt has implications not only in the short run. So it depends on how both fiscal and monetary policy will react in the years to come. But also inflation is affected by the, as we know, supply and demand. So depends on the also on the supply chains and the demand of goods, whether it will be rising so as to meet the supply or not. Because if we have deficit in if the supply will rise to meet the demand, because if we have a deficit in supply, usually prices of certain products rise. But when we talk about inflation, also it is important to see that not only the global inflation rate, but also of some products, because there were some products whose price really went up, and they're products that are usually perhaps spent by poor people. Or so if we want to analyze the effect on the well-being of people, maybe a more detailed analysis should be conducted. But overall, in the short run, I believe the situation with the present interest rates and the economic policies, I believe in the short run will not lead to a drastic inflation rise.
Okay, thank you. And a question for Elena would be, Milton Friedman talked about economic freedom all the time and how it brings in the end political freedom. And because this is again the Free Market Roadshow Skopje, I'm going to bring it to back to Macedonia and the developing world, let's say. So what would you say is more important for progress, the economic freedom or the political freedom? Because we both know they go hand in hand. Do you see something as more important, or they're so mutual that you cannot take one and not the other?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. I believe they go hand by hand, and practically when we were reading some paper in order to find this connection between the human freedom and the economic growth, we can see that practically as the economic inequality increase, as there are practically lower investment in human capital and so on, lower growth rates, there is of course some kind of lowering of the political stability. So I would say that one affects the other, and somewhere practically in the current practically crisis, we have seen that economic growth can practically influence on the lowering of the political stability. What I want to say here is that by lowering the economic rates, we can see that most of the quality of the education, of the life, of the health, and so on, practically cause some kind of lowering of the political stability. So I believe it's practically the interconnection exists, but as an economist, I would say that economy usually dictates the political stability.
I would agree. Because we are nearing the end, I would like to ask the last question, and it goes to Katerina, and I would ask you, what would be the lessons, the positive lessons that we have learned from COVID? We all know everything that's bad, but what is the good thing in a nutshell that we have learned from this crisis?
Okay, so one of the biggest achievement from the COVID crisis, I don't know if I can say it achievement, but like the greatest things that occurred after and during the crisis was the digitalization, for example. Digitalization is not new, it was here before the COVID crisis, but COVID has learned us that it's very important to use the digital world in order to function in the 21st century. Nowadays, it's normal even for the older people to use electronic devices, to use mobile phones, to use tablets, laptops, to communicate on Skype, on Zoom, on Viber, on every other video conference platform. So it just make make the life easier of the people in order it make them feel more comfortable when using this solution. From free market perspective, what I think is digitalization is very helpful for the prosperity of the humanity. But what is more important is that digitalization comes without support and without the help of the government. So all of these apps that were developed, all of these initiatives, food delivery, telemedicine, lots of different platforms for communication, they all arise based on the private initiatives. And that's why I see this process as one of the biggest advantages, biggest positive results from the COVID crisis. Also, I like the working from home, which is an innovation in the working process. Previously, it was, I can say for Macedonia, it was unmanageable to work from home. It was something that is not, still it's not written in our laws, nor is it something that needs to further be developed. But people found that working from home can work, and I think that this is very helpful for overcoming the bad governmental policies when it comes to the labor market. What I think about this is, let's say, if there is a minimum wage law in the country, it usually hurts the young people and the people that are on the marginalized side, that are on the marginalized group. With work from home, we can help them by supporting their employability. Now, when the business can employ practically anybody, it's very easy to find a job if you have computer and internet access to internet. So it's not very important if you have previous background, if you have previous experience, if you, I don't know, if you are ready to travel, because you can sit in Skopje as resident, be Skopje as resident and work practically wherever you like in the world. So this is something that I found as a also very good, very positive result from the COVID crisis. And if I might add one more, it would be that I see COVID as a beginning of the process of creative destruction, something that Schumpeter has described many years ago. So COVID crisis, the pandemic has showed that there is a possibility to develop new products, to develop new services, to innovate the current services, to innovate the current products. Many businesses has accessed and started to present their work on different markets. So there is some innovative energy that I think will create a very positive energy, prosperous intentions in the near future. I am not underestimating the bad consequences. Of course, that these 2 years were very difficult years. I'm not speaking only about the economics, but I'm speaking about the personal burden, the healthcare burden, the lack of human rights, etc. But if we are optimistic, then we can say that if we follow the things that we have learned from the COVID crisis, maybe in future we can have a better world than the one that we're having right now.
Can I just add something?
Go on.
Thank you. Katerina put it very well, the lessons learned, and I would just like to add a few words about the labor market. She already mentioned the possibilities for work from home, which I must admit for working mothers is not as easily if the children are at home. But nevertheless, I believe that this pandemic will cause permanent changes in the labor market. In terms of a greater flexibility of labor markets, due to the possibilities for work from home, for working online. And I believe it will change not only the way the labor market works, but perhaps even it will perhaps make some companies think about ways to reduce their costs. For example, if a part of the people can work from home, there will be less need for less offices, for example, in some companies. So it will gradually change. I believe it will affect the costs. This is a type of reduction of costs for companies. So I believe that the companies now are seeing some ways to make their operations more efficient and more effective. And of course, the free choice is I believe a bigger, not only for labor, but also, as Katerina mentioned, for education, as many online courses are becoming more accessible for people all over the world.
I would just like to add about the education, if I have time. I think that COVID has showed us more than ever that we need to educate ourselves all of the time, so that education is a permanent process. It was something in this part of the year of the world, like people just follow the rules. They go to elementary school, secondary school, and finish university, and then they stopped with their growing, they stopped with reading, they stopped with learning new things. What we learned here is that learning is becoming everyday activities. And even when my grandparents are starting to use Facebook for video calls, it means that everybody can learn everything only if he or she has the desire to do it. So that's like what I see is a message, especially for the young people, that COVID is showing us that everything is possible if we have the desire, and if we have the curiosity to learn new things and grow in a way.
Invest in ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time, and with that positive view of the future, we've come to the end of this year's edition to the Digital Free Market Roadshow. I would like to thank Biljana, Elena, and Katerina for joining us today. Of course, Per Bylund for his keynote speech. I would like also to thank our audience, and don't forget that the Free Market Roadshow continues in Podgorica on the 13th of May, when we will continue our discussion, this time on encouraging entrepreneurship. Hope to see you all there, and to have the chance to, of course, see you next year for the 2022 Free Market Roadshow edition, but hopefully in person. And until then, take care.